Okay.
Thank you. And hello to people joining us. We shall wait for the numbers to rise before we go ahead, but welcome. And there's still people joining us, which is very nice.
Lovely. Couple of familiar names, lots of unfamiliar names. Oh, really good spread of people. That looks fantastic.
Good afternoon, everybody. I think we can make a start now. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining us. This webinar is part of the programme for PLASA Online 2021 and is presented by the Association of British Theatre Technicians. My name is Robin Townley. I am the ABTT's Chief Executive, and we are very pleased to be collaborating with webinars throughout all 4 days of PLASA Online. Today, I shall be introducing our speaker and helping to answer as many of your questions as possible. Before that, some reminders about the arrangements for the webinar. As with other Zoom events, we recommend selecting gallery view so that you can see all the panelists at the same time. The button for this can be found in the top right corner of your screen. We do not have live closed caption subtitles this afternoon, but the recording of this session will be posted on the ABTT website, where there will be closed caption subtitles available by clicking on the CC button. You may use the chat function in this webinar to talk amongst yourselves. The chat button can be found on the bar at the bottom of your screen. Alicia, the ABTT coordinator with whom many of you will have communicated, will be looking after this today, and she will say hello to you all in the chat now. Please do post in the chat box, and it would be great if you would let us know where you are joining us from today. Feel free to chat to one another and give your thoughts throughout the event. We're always pleased to hear from you. Alicia will also post any useful links and information in the chat throughout the webinar. When we use screen share this afternoon, the screen will reorganize itself to display the shared visual content, but it will return to the previous screen when the sharing stops. You don't need to do anything. Most importantly, this session gives us an opportunity to address your questions. At any time during the webinar, please do post questions, thoughts, or comments you would like our speaker to discuss using the Q&A tab, which may also be found in the bar at the bottom of your screen. We shall try and discuss as many questions as possible, so do post them as soon as you can. Today's webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be available on the ABTT website, along with all the relevant information after the event. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker. And I don't have to ask him to wave when I mention his name, because he's the only other person you will be able to see at the moment. So welcome, Paddy Dillon. Paddy is an award-winning theatre architect. He is Deputy Chair of the Theatres Trust and chairs the ABTT's International Theatre Engineering and Architecture Conference. In May 2020, he began the Theatre Green Book, an initiative to help theatre in the UK move towards sustainability. The first volume, Sustainable Productions, is now in use and available for anyone to review, use, and feedback about. The remaining volumes, Sustainable Buildings, and thirdly, Sustainable Operations, will be published later this year. Thank you very much, Paddy, for being here. And I think I'm going to hand over to you to get started.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Robin, and thanks to all of you for joining this afternoon. And I think Robin mentioned that one of my roles is as chair of ITAC, the ABTT's theatre conference. And it was, I think, through conversations around ITAC just before COVID started, that it became clear that although sustainability has been part of the live conversation in theatre for so long, very many of you I know will have been thinking and talking about sustainability. Many of you will have been pioneering ways of working differently and looking for ways to create theatre more sustainably for a long time. And you'll all be familiar with Julie's Bicycle or Creative Carbon Scotland, with EcoStage or Staging Change, many of the other organisations within theatre that have been talking about this and have been for years. And yet when it came up in conversations we were having last winter, it was very much in the context of frustration that despite all of that commitment, all of that interest, theatre as a sector has made in some ways so far quite little progress towards responding to the urgent climate crisis that we're all now facing. And when COVID hit, we started to have some conversations. And when I say we, I just mean within the Theatres Trust, within the ABTT, among just theatre makers and practitioners that I know, about why that might be the case. And I think what became clear was a number of things, because there was no shortage of theatre makers of all kinds, technical directors, production managers, whoever, who passionately wanted theatre to move towards sustainability and felt, as I do, as I'm sure all of you do, that if theatre is to take a voice in this incredibly urgent dialogue, then theatre itself needs to show that we are working sustainably. There was no shortage of people who believed that from all across theatre, and yet they would find, and I heard this from production managers, from designers, from all quarters, that if they went into a show, however strongly they felt about making it more sustainably, it was impossible to get process unless the show had been set up to enable sustainability, unless the director was equally passionate, unless they had some conversation with the set builder, the costume supervisor, with the people who were procuring the materials that actually went into the show. And I think what became clear was a number of things that we needed to achieve if theatre was going to start making this journey in a really purposeful way. And the key one was that sustainability doesn't belong to any one person in the chain. You can't just say, this is for the designer to worry about. This is for the production manager to worry about. Everybody has to change what they're doing to make a show more sustainable, but also needs to know what to expect of others as well. The chain of people involved in making a production is so interwoven, is so complex. Producers, designers, props people, wigs, hair and makeup, set makers, that everybody needs not only to change what they do to achieve a more sustainable show, but also to know that everybody else is working in a coordinated way as well. It wasn't just about changing one person's practice, it was about changing how the system as a whole works. That became clear to us from these conversations. It also became clear, I think, that if theatre as a whole wants to move towards sustainability, then we have to achieve a kind of critical mass. Theatre is made by freelancers. It's made by teams that change for every show. Somebody might be dropping in as a set maker, as a director, to make a show in Edinburgh, and then the next show they make is in Plymouth, and the one after that they make is in London, and each time they're working with a different team. And if all theatres have a different approach, if they choose a different methodology and work in different ways, and prioritise different things, then theatre as a whole can't move forwards. We have somehow to arrive at a shared methodology, at a shared way of thinking and talking about sustainability, at a shared understanding of what will make shows truly sustainable, if we're all going to be able to sublimate sustainability into our practice and work together. By analogy, if you imagine what it would be like if every theatre had a different rule book for health and safety and took a different approach to health and safety, there would be constant accidents, because what we need is for everybody to understand sustainability in the same way and know that the people around them in the team also understand the same standards and follow the same guidance. So we needed to achieve critical mass if this was going to get anywhere. And by now, it was becoming clear, of course, why despite all of that commitment and indeed expertise across theatre, it's been so hard to create meaningful change across a broad front of the whole sector. Now, critical mass straight away implied to us a couple of things. The first was that we needed to be talking to everybody who's already working on this. We were never setting out to reinvent the wheel. And when I say we at this point, I'm really talking about the Theatres Trust and the ABTT, the two organisations I'm most closely connected with, but also the two organisations that spearhead the Yellow Book of Technical Standards. And we knew that it was something like that, a Theatre Green Book, that we needed to arrive at. We were not about displacing other people's ideas or setting up a rival shop. So the first thing we did was talking to Julie's Bicycle, to Creative Carbon Scotland, to SIPA, to bring in the ideas that have already been developed, and there are loads of them, and bring them together in one place for theatre makers to use. And I think the final thing we realised as the Theatre Green Book initiative started to move forwards was that we both needed to be listening to practical theatre makers on the ground. We needed to know what are the decisions that technicians face, that stage managers face, that costume supervisors face. The guidance had to come from theatre for theatre, but also that we needed sustainability expertise as part of that mix. There isn't a huge amount of carbon literacy across this sector any more than there is across my sector as an architect or elsewhere. We needed people who could crunch the numbers, who knew the methodologies, who'd written bespoke guidance for other sectors before. And so we raised money within theatre to bring on board Bureau Happold, who are fantastic sustainability engineers, in order to put together the guidance and shape it and tell us what really matters if we want theatre to work more sustainably. Somewhere in these early conversations, we took the decision that to tackle theatre as a whole, we needed to divide it into 3 strands. And the first was sustainable productions, how to make shows more sustainably. That's what we're talking about today. And that's the title of the first volume of the Theatre Green Book, which is out there, which you can download and use freely now. And I think Alicia has put the link into the chat. But there are 2 other volumes on the way. One is about how to make theatre buildings more sustainable. We're working on that now. It'll be out in a couple of months. And the third is about sustainable operations, your front of house, your offices, travel, all of those other subjects, so that together, taking them together, the Theatre Green Book will give guidance for the sector as a whole to respond meaningfully and responsibly to the climate emergency. Going back though to Sustainable Productions, Volume 1, COVID, this tragedy for so many theatre makers and for theatre as a sector has also been the opportunity for making the Theatre Green Book, for the very simple reason that so many of you will normally be so busy on shows that it would be impossible to get you together to provide the feedback, the knowledge, the expertise that we need. But because of COVID, you were able to come on board. We brought together focus groups of producers, of set makers, of props people, of lighting people, of production managers, of designers, and later of writers and so on. And we're still now finding areas that because we put it together as quickly as we could, to make sure there was guidance ready for theatres as they reopened. And we're still now finding people who have really strong ideas that we can put into the Green Book. And so one of the things I'm going to ask you today is that if you spot gaps, please do get in touch. This is not a finished article. It's something that we're making collaboratively and collectively, and we need all of your help to shape it to a tool that can really change theatre. Having got together all of those focus groups in the course of November and December last year, we got out a first draft in January, and the response to that has been absolutely fantastic. We had the Association of Lighting Designers, individual costume wardrobe mistresses and costume supervisors coming together, getting in touch and saying, look, there's a gap here. We don't think you've included this. We've been working on sustainability for years, and this is what we've learned. We had scenic artists getting in touch who'd done research into paints and painting materials. All of that started coming together. And so we added to the Green Book a toolkit, a resource section, which would be a centre where theatre makers could go as they make their work. And from all of that, we developed the version that's now online and which theatres can now use to make shows. We're calling it a beta version for trialling. We know we haven't got it right first time. We need to learn from you as you make shows to feed back to us what works, what doesn't work, what's easy, what's hard, to help us shape it for theatre. And we'll reach a final version probably in the autumn, depending on how quickly theatres manage to reopen. So what I wanted to do now is I'm going to take over the screen and walk you all through the Theatre Green Book quite quickly, because you can download it and look at it yourselves in more detail, and then leave plenty of time at the end for questions and for discussion. So sharing my screen, I hope you can all see that. That's the front page of the Theatre Green Book. You'll see it's volume 1 for sustainable productions, volumes 2 and 3, sustainable buildings, sustainable operations, are quickly coming through the pipeline. And you'll see too that we're calling it a beta version for trialing. I should probably have said that this whole initiative is not about preaching or testing or judging or saying that some people are better than others. We all know there's a climate emergency, and we all want theatre to respond to it. It's up to you as theatre makers to tell us what's working, to tell us what's hard, to tell us what's easy, and to move on this journey at your own pace. I said earlier on that we've been contacting everybody to bring on board their expertise, and from the initial partnership of the Theatres Trust and the ABTT, really everybody in UK theatre is now on board. UK Theatre itself and Society of London Theatres, ITC, the Federation of Scottish Theatres, Crew Cymru, Theatre and Dance Northern Ireland, Julie's Bicycle, Creative Carbon Scotland, and so on and so on. You can see the logos there. If any of you belongs to an organisation, and there are a couple that we've been talking to since this version went up, and would like to partner us and help us keep developing the Green Book, then do please get in touch. So the contents, and I'm going to start rather oddly at the back. The toolkit there, you can see outlined in green, has very much been put together by theatre makers who are passionate about sustainability and who have been working with it already. And as we get to that, please do get in touch if you can help us develop it. But you can see before that the 3 main sections at a glance, and we'll go through this in a minute. And it's just, what does it mean to work more sustainably? Yes, it's about using less material. That's almost the principal thing. All of that stuff that at a certain time would have been made from plywood that comes from virgin forests, that is irreplaceable and that might end up in a skip. That's what theatre has to change if theatre makers want to work more sustainably. And of course, it's about using less energy in technical theatre. It's about controlling deliveries and so on. Why? Well, the principles section, which I'm not going to go through in a lot of detail today, but there is a lot of detail in it for those who really want the background and want to see where the guidance comes from. But it's the guidance itself that is really the heart of the Theatre Green Book. And for those of you who don't want to wade through pages and pages of text, that's where to go, because in a few pages, we've boiled down what you need to do to make shows sustainably. The Theatre Green Book is a practical tool for theatre making. There's loads of fantastic, futuristic, utopian thinking online about how theatre can be and perhaps should be in the future. We were learning from that, but starting at the other end. What the question we wanted to answer is, how do I, as a theatre maker, make a show today that's more sustainable? What can I do now in order to start this journey? Because as we know, we only have less than 9 years to reach 2030, and a point at which climate change, even the hope to keep down to a 2-degree increase in global temperature, will start to become unobtainable. So what are the steps towards sustainability? When I was saying earlier on that the Green Book needs to reach a critical mass, that means that it needs to be something that all theatre makers can use, whether you're working at a large scale or a small scale, whether you're building based or doing touring work, whether you're working in theatres or doing site-specific or outdoor work, whether your show is large or small, whether it's opera or new writing, you still need to be able to work more sustainably, and the principles are exactly the same. But it meant that we had to come up with steps along that journey towards sustainability. There has to be an advanced level, and you can see it there, which represents a truly sustainable show, a zero carbon show. But there also has to be a baseline, which is a first rung on the ladder for theatre makers whose business model can't change overnight, whose audience can't change overnight, who have established way of workings that, yes, need to change, but will change more slowly. So we've got 3 tiers: baseline, intermediate, advanced, and the guidance for them is all there just on one page to explain what you need to do in the guidance section. So let's start moving through the Theatre Green Book. And what, in principle, is it we're talking about? Well, fundamentally, of course, the creative challenge of theatre making is also at the heart of making theatre more sustainably. Sustainability is not something that we can bolt on afterwards to the process and do at the last minute. It's not something that a producer or artistic director can give to their TD and expect it to happen by magic. It's something that everybody, from beginning to end of a show, needs to be involved in. It has to be there in the conceptual thinking. Just to give an obvious example, a bare stage show or a show that requires one quite abstract set is much easier to make sustainably than a show which requires multiple very complex sets. That doesn't mean it's right or wrong. There are sustainable ways to make visually complex shows, but it shows how the conceptual thinking will determine the path towards sustainability, and the conceptual thinking has to bear sustainability in mind, just like other parameters like budget and program. It's about collaboration. Theatre, in order to make it more efficient, can often be a very linear, a very siloed process. It starts with the creative team that produces a concept, it's developed, you end up with a model, and so on. And just to give an example that came to me from a set builder, of being given a 1 to 25 model and a budget and a tight program and told that's what needs to happen. And by then it's too late to have the conversations that would have made that show sustainable, to go back to the designer and say, could we modify this set slightly, because then I know that we have something in store that we could reuse, for example. So collaboration means having the people in the room early on, the practical theatre makers, as part of the creative dialogue from the outset, in order to take a vision and nudge it together collaboratively, using all of the combined expertise that goes into a show towards sustainability. It's about flexibility, not taking an idea and then saying, okay, that's it, that's what's got to happen, but accepting those ideas, those suggestions that will move it towards the most sustainable version of itself. And fundamentally, at its heart, it's about materials. It's about reusing and recycling. It's about avoiding the virgin and raw materials that can make even theatre making damaging to the planet. To make that happen, shows need to be produced in a different way. So producers are involved as well. And again, they can't just hand it along the chain to the practical end of theatre. The show needs to be set up in the first place to make sure that all theatre makers are involved in the process, to make clear that the invitation right at the outset is clear to everybody. Everybody knows this is going to be a Theatre Green Book baseline show, to set the budget and schedule so that there's time for those early meetings. So the budget is paying for designers' time and theatre makers' time rather than going into plywood and steel. Making sure that the meetings are there so that sustainability doesn't get forgotten, and making sure that everybody reviews and shares at the end. There's no doubt that making theatre sustainably is a steep learning curve, just like everything else that we're doing to adapt to this emergency, travelling, eating, the way we live. It's a steep learning curve, and theatre will find it easier if we can do that quickly and share what we learn at the end of each show. Making and disposal, designing and sourcing sustainability will take more time. Finding recycled or salvaged materials takes time. Costumes, it will take time to go out there and find things secondhand rather than just by fast purchasing off the internet. Workshops, processes need to be set up in a sustainable way. Materials I've talked about, we need to be finding reused and recycled materials. And after the show, where before, or certainly 10 or 20 years ago, a lot might end up in a skip. Now people need to be spending time. Theatre makers need to be spending the time to make sure that all the materials that have gone into a show do have an afterlife and future uses. And that's all about the journey from a linear to a circular economy for theatre. And then with technical theatre, the challenges will be slightly different. It'll be about planning to make sure that if possible, you can share technical setup between adjacent shows, so you're not remaking rigs every time. It's about planning deliveries, the white vans that turn up just before the first preview or the first rehearsals. Can those be streamlined to reduce the carbon footprint of the show? And it's about switch-on routines to try and reduce energy so far as possible. And we've got some fantastic advice in the Green Book that's come from technical theatre makers and designers to help us with that. So a sustainable production isn't going to be massively different from what you're used to. It will go through exactly the same steps, but sustainability will be part of the thinking all the way through. And when it comes to procuring materials for the show, it will lean on reuse and recycling, and will return them to reuse and recycling afterwards. And it will involve reviewing and learning so that the next show becomes easier. Now, at this point, many of you, when you've got the guide in front of you, will skip straight through just by clicking on it to the principles, I beg your pardon, to the guidance, which will really take you through the steps of a show and explain in detail what sustainable theatre making is about. I'm going to page turn quickly through the principles without dwelling on too many of them, but just to give you an idea of the substance we've got in the Theatre Green Book for those of you who do want to go into it. So we've got an introduction that talks, for example, about how the Theatre Green Book sits with pledges towards net zero. Effectively, an advanced show is going to be a net zero show, but equally, energy and carbon is not the only aspect of working sustainably. It's also about reducing our resource use and reducing our materials use. It talks about the other volumes in the Green Book. It talks about some of the other benefits that can come from working in a more sustainable way. Connecting with your community can be a result of looking for local sources of materials and products. Working in a more collaborative, a more collective way that involves the whole team in decision-making can, of course, change, we really hope for the better, the relationships within production teams. For example, there's a page here about basic principles. I'm just going to touch on two of them. One is this rather colourful pyramid at the top, because this is the kind of thinking, sustainable thinking, that needs to become second nature for the decision-making that goes into a show. So the left-hand side is about where materials come from. The right-hand side is about what happens to them afterwards. So starting at the top, there's always got to be the question of, do we need this? So if you're a designer and you're thinking about what goes into a set, the question has to be there of, is this necessary? Is this helping tell the story? Is it pushing the drama forwards? If it is, then fine, let's work out where it comes from. So the next question is there one in store or something so similar in store that I could adapt the idea to use it? Or if not that, is there something that we could find locally? Let's say it's a staircase. Has another theatre got one? Is there one coming off another theatre that we could adapt and reuse rather than starting from raw steel and raw timber? If we have to make something from scratch, if there's a really good artistic reason for doing it, then let's look at the materials we're using, make sure that they are repurposed, salvage, net zero if possible, or at least low carbon materials. And the very worst thing, the thing that I'm sure nobody on this show would want to do, would be to use unsustainable materials, trees logged in the rainforests of Brazil and then ending up on a theatre stage in the UK is something that none of us, I'm sure, would want to be doing. And in disposing of materials, it's the same in reverse. Yes, you can put things to landfill, but if we want to move towards a circular economy, then we need to go up this side of the pyramid. So yes, timber could be burnt as biomass. That's better than nothing. Even better, we could disassemble it and recycle the materials. Even better than that, use it as it is, find a local use. And of course, once you're into things like costumes, this becomes entirely practical of making sure that things do have an afterlife. The only other thing to pull out on that page is carbon calculators. A lot of you, most of you will be familiar with the idea. Within the Theatre Green Book, we recommend their use for advanced shows. We're quite sure that they're part of the future of theatre making. We're not recommending their use for most shows, for baseline or intermediate shows. That's because really specific ones tailored for theatre making have not really been developed yet. We talk later on about the ones you can start experimenting with. And mostly there isn't a huge database of information to back them up yet. So we've come up with something much simpler to use for the moment, although we're sure that carbon calculators will increasingly come in the years ahead. The creative challenge, a couple of pages there I won't dwell on, written with a lot of help from ADs, directors, writers, and others. You'll see here a panel, and there's one on all of these pages that can link forward to some resources you'll find in the toolkit. Some advice from producers. This is all about making sure that you've got time in your schedule for those early conversations when everybody is coming together to review sustainability at concept stage, at white card stage. We're calling that green card stage, where you're not only reviewing the white card model for budget and against program, but also are we hitting our, let's say, intermediate Green Book standard, and if not, let's have the whole team working together on how we make sure we do, and then making sure there's time in the schedule for disposal afterwards. There are some sections here, well, first of all, on what that means for the budget, and the budget will be different. It won't be bigger, and we have that from technical directors and production managers who have worked on sustainable shows. You don't need to spend more overall, but you will spend it differently. More will go to people, less will go on stuff. And that can only be a good move for theatre as a whole. There are some pieces here on touring and outdoor shows, won't apply to everyone. And also something on commissioning whole shows and seasons. A lot of theatre makers who remember the sort of more traditional rep model have commented on how sustainable it was. If you had one designer doing a whole season of shows, then you would find that once the first show was dismantled, a lot of the components of the set would be modified, reused, turn up again in other shows. It was a very sustainable way of working. And still now, if producers are able to commission a whole sequence of shows together, it's far easier to achieve sustainable outcomes. An example of that was the NT's TravelX season. This was done not for sustainability, but for cost reasons, where a season of TravelX shows would all share a floor. Now, of course, that's also a really sustainable thing to do. Making sets and scenery. I've talked a bit about the materials hierarchy. There are some notes here on scenic art. This is all about just the principles behind working sustainably. And the same applies to props making. The same applies to costumes. We've got a lot of detail here on costumes. Wigs, hair and makeup is something that I think we're probably slightly weak at the moment in the Theatre Green Book, and we've had some really good conversations recently about how we strengthen that section of the guidance. Lighting, sound, and AV. Again, we've had a lot of help here on lighting. We're expecting some help to come in from the Association of Sound Designers, which we'll try and get into the Green Book as soon as we can. AV is perhaps something we still need to strengthen, and all help is welcomed on that. Sustainability is probably harder now than it will be in 5 years' time. We've said that the Theatre Green Book is about making work. Now, there are things which aren't in place yet. There isn't a huge infrastructure for storage of theatre. Once that comes into place, and I'm sure it will, we're looking at initiatives right at the moment, then reuse and recycling will become much easier. Carbon calculators will become much more widespread. The next year or two is the hardest. After that, I'm quite sure that sustainability will become part of normal practice, just like health and safety, and theatre can then start to move very rapidly towards a genuinely sustainable future. The Theatre Green Book is for everybody, but of course different theatre makers working at different scales in different contexts face slightly different challenges, and they're captured there. But the main purpose of the guidance, the heart of it, are these three standards that I talked about: baseline, intermediate, advanced. And it was something that theatre makers told us again and again in focus groups is, please make it specific. We can go online and find general guidance about sustainability. We've been talking about it for 10, 20 years. We know about that. What we want to know is what in our practice as we make shows tomorrow, what should we be doing differently? What should we be doing? And so the guidance of the Theatre Green Book is all here on this one page. 3 steps, as I said: baseline, intermediate, advanced, and we've broken a show down into steps which all of you will recognize, from the invitation, through putting the team together, through setting budget and schedule, concept, development, making, through to disposal at the end. 2 more steps at the bottom that only apply for outdoor and touring shows. So those are steps you'll all recognize. And for each of those, we've defined very straightforwardly what needs to be different to make a show reach, in this case, baseline standard, to make sure that that show really is a sustainable production. So just walking through a couple of them, making sure that the baseline standard is stated as part of the initial invitation. Making sure that a green production agreement is signed by everybody. That's to make sure that everybody understands what's involved from day one. Appointing the team early. That's so that the makers can be part of those early conversations that will nudge an idea towards sustainability. Setting the budget and schedule to support sustainable working. And I hope that it's become clear so far that this is not a huge extra burden. We know how stressed theatre making is, how tough the programs are, how tight the budgets are. The last thing theatre makers need is a really complex extra process to bolt on top. So this very much, we hope, can sit seamlessly alongside what you're doing anyway. That doesn't mean, though, that there isn't hard guidance, solid achievement, real progress, built into the guidance. And here it is here. So for instance, we're saying that 50% of each category of materials that go into a production, that set, costumes, props, and so on, has a previous life. It comes from a reused or recycled source. That's a step. It's not, we think, an impossible step. Steel deck, for instance, is already reused and recycled. Often flats, floors are quite easy to reuse and recycle. Costumes and props certainly are very often reused and recycled. But it does mean that anyone who achieves baseline standard has made a meaningful step on the road towards sustainability. And once we get up to a genuine, advanced, a zero carbon show, then we're saying that all materials will either come from reused and recycled sources or will be accredited zero carbon. Moving on, still under baseline, avoiding harmful materials, the products that are used in wigs, hair, makeup, costumes, and so on. We've got a list of those to avoid at all costs. Minimizing deliveries, and then some more hard guidance here, a real hurdle to get over, if you like, is making sure that 65% of materials that have been in the show are reused and recycled afterwards. So how do you achieve that? There's the guidance. How do we achieve it? Well, on the next 3 pages, we take each of those tiers. Let's do baseline first and go through exactly the same steps from invitation, production agreement, team, same steps, and say who needs to do what in a production to make sure that that step is achieved. So that initial invitation, it's the producer's job. Preparing a green production agreement is for the producer to do and everybody else to sign. And we've got columns here for directors and designers, for production managers, and for production staff, makers and suppliers. And you'll see when you go into this in more detail that there are links all the way through here. That will take you to the toolkit, the resources sector, where we've compiled resources to make this easier. So that link there will take you to a green production agreement that everybody can use. And the same set of steps, the same set of responsibilities applies to intermediate and to advanced level. Because to underline something I said at the outset, sustainability can't be achieved just by one person. It's not just down to the set maker. It's not just down to the production manager. Everybody in the team has a role in achieving this. So that's the guidance. And the last section of the Theatre Green Book for Sustainable Productions is the toolkit, which, as I said, has been put together by all of you. And I think there are some names on the call who've very much been part of this. It will continue to develop, and I really hope that one of the outcomes of the call is for you to identify where the gaps are. We know there are gaps, and I hope to step forward to help us fill them. But I'll just wheel you quickly through it before we go over to some questions. There's the typical green production agreement I was talking about. This is a checklist for theatres to put together of sustainable resources in their area, and of things like putting shows in touch with the teams who are doing the show before and the show that comes after them on that stage, so that they can talk about sharing, for example, technical rigs. Sustainability champions, each show needs a champion. It's not the owner, it's not the policeman, it's just somebody to coordinate. Those are the carbon calculators we know about that some of you will like to start experimenting with. Julie's Bicycle, Creative Carbon Scotland, both have great general calculators that you can start to use. Climate literacy training, incredibly important for all of us, not just in theatre, but these are the resources we know about that have worked well for theatre makers. A bit more on budgeting and programming. The materials inventory is our quick and dirty carbon calculator, which most of you will use on baseline and intermediate shows. It's really simple. It's an Excel spreadsheet, which in due course you'll be able to download from the website. And it takes each category of materials, here's sets and scenery, and just lists them out: the floor base, staircase, suspended structure. This is an imaginary show, saying what it's made of. And if you know the weight, steelwork, you'll normally know the weight, you can put it here and work out whether or not you're achieving, where it comes from, and whether you're achieving that target of 50% recycled. If you don't know the weight, just do it by number. So wire cables in this imaginary show, 8 of them, we don't know the weight, but it doesn't matter. You can still work out whether or not they've come from a reused source or not. And then there's a column for what happens to everything afterwards. It's perfectly easy to use. It doesn't involve putting in lots and lots of data. It's using the data that everybody would already know. Same for props and furniture, for costumes, and so on. There's a page on how to make sure that you're having review meetings, modeling tools for designers who want to switch from physical models to working digitally, workshops guidance, all the resources we can find for reuse and recycling, organisations like Set Exchange, Reset Scenery in Glasgow. Many of you will already know some of these, and the organisations that do disposable waste like First Mile. Modular design and making fit assembly, that's all about making sets in a way that they can be more easily disassembled. And sustainable sourcing is all about how you make sure that your timber and steel is coming from the most sustainable possible sources that you can find. Lists of harmful materials to avoid at all costs. Information on scenic art, on props, a lot on costumes. This is really fantastic guidance that came in from some costume makers. Ditto on lighting. We're missing, for example, a sound page. We're missing pages on wigs, hair and makeup, which we hope we're on the way towards filling in, but some notes at the end on outdoor and site specific and on touring productions. So I'm going to draw a deep breath at that point. There at the end is the acknowledgements, I hope just showing quite how many of you have already been involved in putting together the Theatre Green Book, and I really hope that more of you will become involved. Where are we now? I'm going to stop sharing. Where are we now? The Theatre Green Book is out there for trialling. We've got loads of theatres and producers and companies signing up to trial. If you're involved, if you can influence that process, please do bring more shows for trialing, because the more people are using this, the quicker it will become just a natural part of theatre making practice. And the more we can learn from your experience to strengthen the Theatre Green Book for the future.
Paddy, I'm going to dive in because we've got questions coming in. Thank you so much for that, and for the whistle stop but really good tour of Volume 1. Straight away then, what is involved in trialling the Green Book, and how would we go about doing this?
We are building up or working on the website at the moment. It will be ready, I hope, by the end of this week. On it, there'll be a registration form. Who are you? What's the show? What's the scale of venue? Fill in everything you can. There may be stuff you don't know yet, budget, whatever. But fill it in and then start working with the Theatre Green Book. As I hope's been clear from the Whistle Stop tour, it's not rocket science. It does involve working differently, and it involves working differently from the outset. The only reaction, and I feel very, very confident about the take-up of the Theatre Green Book, just from what so many theatre makers have been saying over the last couple of months. The reaction that worries me is when people say, okay, we'll cherry pick a few bits from it, or we'll get a couple of ideas from it. It's really not like that. Unless you can make a show differently, you're not going to be taking a meaningful step towards responding to the climate emergency. And unless you constitute the show and set it up differently, it's going to be very hard to achieve that. So do start at the beginning and work through. But then it is just a matter of working through it, and we hope it's straightforward. There's an email, which I think is on the chat. You're always welcome to get in touch. And there are lots and lots of theatre makers who've been involved in this, who we can put you in touch with, whether you're a scenic artist or a director. And there'll be a forum on the website where you can share ideas. I'm doing seminars like this one from time to time. If you want to put together your team for a show and get in touch and get a couple of theatres or a couple of teams together, and we'll do a seminar and answer questions together, we'll do that too. So we'll give you all the support we can. No one is going to judge you. No one is going to, mark you down if you find it's too difficult or if it all goes wrong. The whole point of trialing is to learn from this collectively and to feedback on what you find out.
Thank you, Paddy. And some feedback raising a question. This is from Rachel Duthie. My initial experience in reading the Green Book was that I needed to go through it and write a set of design guidelines for our freelance design team, for them to understand what we'd be asking of them at conception and invitation. This was quite a mission. I wondered if sharing of some initial outlines for this sort of document might be helpful.
Really helpful. Yes, anything like that. Let's get it together. Let's get it into the resource toolkit so that others can use it. And if you've got some sort of first thoughts that you've drafted down about that, then send them across and let's talk about them together and develop them together. Or I can put you in touch with others who are in exactly the same stage as you, and let's work on this together. There's no need for every theatre to keep reinventing the wheel on this. Let's share experiences and share expertise on putting together the tools for it.
Thank you. Moving straight on. We have already started planning and designing for our reopening show. Is it too late to get on board with the Green Book?
I think the answer is no, but I'm going to say a little bit more about that. I said, or I picked up on the way through the Theatre Green Book, that moment of invitation is incredibly important. And so, just imagine as a producer, if you're calling up, say, a director and designer initially, to say we want to do a show in 2022 or whatever it might be. If at that point you say, and it's going to be a Theatre Green Book baseline show, let's say, then it's just part of the proposition. It's like giving them a date, giving them a budget or whatever. Once you've started, if you then say, oh, and let's make it sustainably, there's a risk that it feels like a restriction, that ideas have already started developing, and it then becomes, a restriction. So I think the answer is have a chat with your team and make sure that they're on for it. If they are, then I don't think there's any harm at all in starting a bit late, and then you can just go through the process exactly as we've talked about. And because we're trialing, I think I'd say that even for those of you who are bringing back to life productions that you started work on before COVID, or that have already got some way, or you've already got to white card even, you can still learn something, because as I say, nobody's judging it. Nobody's sort of, logging that this was a show that tried to achieve baseline but didn't. That's so not the spirit of this or the point of it. People will still start to learn, for example, where there are reused and recyclable resources. They'll start to learn what the process of disposal feels like. And in a way, it's far more important that we all set out on that journey and begin that learning curve than that we, either pass or fail the first show we try. If it takes 2 or 3 shows to get up to speed, that's fine. Don't beat yourself up about it. But yes, start. Let's get going. We don't have long to work with this, so let's really start making shows sustainably just as soon as we can.
Fantastic. Very quickly, how far away are the initial building and operations resources from their beta stage?
Building is probably 6 weeks away. We've done lots of focus groups. We want to get a draft out to, and in the same way as Sustainable Productions, we've been talking to theatre owners, facility managers, executive directors, and so on, the people who face the challenge of upgrading buildings. And of course, as a theatre architect, this is on my patch as well, and we've got groups of design professionals together to talk about it. Again, we want to go out to theatre owners and managers and EDs and FMs to get feedback on the guidance once we've put it together. I think that will probably be in about 4 to 5 weeks, and from there we'll get to a final version as quickly as we can. It probably doesn't need to be a beta version. We've got much more data about sustainability works in buildings than we do in productions. So I think that will be available in about 6-7 weeks' time. Sustainable operations will follow, but by the autumn, we're hoping that all 3 volumes will be out there for all of you to use.
Thank you. Could this initiative, this from Richard Bunting, could this initiative lead to a similar standard as Albert in television production? A badge or logo that productions can put in their promotional materials or programs?
Yes, and so we were talking about this just the other day. We've got a logo pretty much ready for people who are doing sustainable productions to use. We think it's really important to bring audiences along on this journey and to get their pressure behind it as well. So the answer is yes. I think it's very unlikely in the short term, though, that we'll be, as it were, validating shows. We don't, you're kind of looking at the organisation pretty much at the moment with Robin and me, plus lots and lots of volunteer theatre makers who've given time to it. But we don't have an organisation that can come in and tick off on shows and say, yes, you achieved intermediate. You can do that for yourselves. But it means that we probably won't be sort of putting a badge on it. But yes, there will be a logo that we would be delighted for all of you who are trialling this to use and to share.
Do we have any indication of who's using it already?
Yes, lots of people. From opera companies, through the National Theatre, through small-scale touring companies, through regional companies that are on a touring circuit and we're looking for touring shows to go through them, small-scale theatres, National Theatre of Scotland, Lyric Hammersmith, Royal Court. I'm doing a seminar, and this I should have said is very much been a conversation across commercial as well as subsidised theatre. It's something that the whole of theatre needs to do. Who am I talking to later this week? The whole team at Hartshorn Hook are coming in. Headlong, we've had conversations with. Many of the commercial producers working in the West End. So the answer is it's very broad. We've got quite a few overseas. NT Ghent in Belgium is doing a trial show. NIDA in Australia, so drama schools. We've had Katie Downton at Guildford, who I think is on the call, has set up some fantastic calls to start exploring this in the student and educational world, which we want to follow up on. So it's very broad, but the broader it is, the better. We need trialling shows and feedback and case studies from across the whole spectrum of theatre if this guidance is going to be as strong as it can for all of you.
Thank you, Paddy. Quite a challenging area now. In a future where budget, staffing and timescales are looking increasingly tight, how can we align this with the sustainable model you have outlined? How does this tie in to the vision for sustainable workloads and work-life balance?
I don't know. That's something I think that only you as theatre makers can have to explore and find answers to. I said earlier that this isn't a preaching initiative. The climate emergency is a reality that we're all living with in our professional lives, in our creative lives, in our personal lives. And you as theatre makers need to make your own decisions about priorities and where those priorities lie and what you put first. It's not for me to tell you what to do or suggest what you should do with that. I think one thing that I would say in relation to work-life balance and so on is that, you know, we know perfectly well, everybody on this call knows how many difficult conversations there are in theatre at the moment about working conditions and pay in theatre, about relationships in theatre, about diversity in theatre. I think sustainability and what's emerged as the method of theatre making that can result in sustainable productions will not solve all of those. And of course, you could say that it masks them or that it gets in the way of them. I really strongly believe that a team that is set up to work in a sustainable way, that is more creative, that is more collaborative, that is spending more of its budget on people rather than on materials, is providing a better and a more honest platform for those conversations than a show that's set up in a very linear and hierarchical way. I'm not going to say more than that. I don't think this is a panacea for everything, but I do think that there's a healthy relationship between working in a sustainable way environmentally and working in a sustainable way in all of the other aspects that you've asked about.
Thank you very much. This from Jessica Nichols. Should this be taught in schools and on apprenticeships?
Yes, I've got absolutely no doubt about that. And I'm quite sure, I mean, again, 2030 is less than 10 years away. And there is no doubt that theatre is going to have to change to respond to the climate emergency. Either it changes through legislation, which will come, or theatre, which is what has turned out to be happening with theatre makers embracing the Theatre Green Book, or the change is going to be in your ownership and of a sort that you have collectively developed. And that's what we've been looking at today. So that means that theatre is going to change very rapidly. And incidentally, I think very excitingly, the theatre that students of whatever sort are going to be making as they come out of the schools is going to be sustainable theatre. And it's also really noteworthy that in the conversations we've had around this, there's been a quite clear generational divide in the sense that everybody, I think, that I've spoken to pretty much has embraced this initiative, but younger theatre makers don't even, in some ways, don't even notice it. It seems like, of course, we need to be making theatre more sustainably. So I think that schools who, although incredibly busy and finding it incredibly hard, of course, to work through the pandemic, have been very enthusiastic in the conversations we've had with them. And I think, yes, will become centres of energy for the change towards sustainable practice.
Thank you, Paddy, and brilliantly timed because we are coming up to the hour. So it just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and explaining the Theatre Green Book project, and in particular Volume 1 Sustainable Productions. It has been an amazing collaboration between the Theatres Trust, the ABTT and Barrow Happold, and all the other collaborators from across and throughout our sector in all the nations of the United Kingdom. And hopefully it will allow us as a sector to set a standard for sustainable practice going forward. It's been very good to bring this webinar to the PLASA Online 2021 programme of events. We're bringing 2 more ABTT curated events, both at 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon about Create Britain, and on Thursday afternoon about the most recent updates to technical standards for places of entertainment. But for now, just to thank you again, Paddy, and I hope everybody who joined us, thank you for joining us, and I hope you found it very useful.
Brilliant. Thanks everyone for joining.
Goodbye.